I've got a new report, and it's from the American Enterprise Institute. It says, in Seattle, the minimum wage hike went to $11 an hour in April. That was April of this year. Seattle goes to $11 an hour. What happened in May? The worst decline in restaurant employment in Seattle since the Great Recession. They lost 1,000 jobs in May. Look who's here. Tamara Holder, who's going to have to defend this, aren't you?
Well, I'm not going to win. We know that.
That's not the case.
So I'm just going to start with my hands behind my back.
Okay, so what would be your defense? $11 an hour goes up to in April, and that city loses 1,000 fast food jobs in May. Doesn't that destroy the whole rationale for this living wage?
Well, let's just start with where you got your information from the American Enterprise Institute, which would be, of course, Stuart, a far-right or center-right think tank. So you don't know how their leanings are skewed, except to the right. They're not. They definitely don't support it. They're not starting.
Well, these are hard numbers. 1,000 jobs gone. I mean, they didn't make it up.
Right, but 1,000 jobs in a city of millions of people is not a lot, especially when...
It's in the fast food business.
Right, but you don't know why
that was the very area where they raised the minimum wage.
Stuart, you don't know why those 1,000 people, 1,000, oh my gosh, it is 1,000 people. It's like the biggest destruction of America of all time.
Well, doesn't it just show you that when you raise immediately the wages of people who haven't done anything to earn that wage whatsoever, you simply legislated that higher wage, doesn't it show you that employers employ less people at that higher wage?
It's, okay, first of all, it's a $15 minimum wage increase over a period of 7 years.
Yes, and it went to $11. It was raised substantially in April, and the jobs were lost in May.
But that's not because there's no evidence that it's because employers are deciding that they're just going to cut their workforce. And if they are, you cannot defend the fact that there is not.
There's no connection. No connection between an $11 an hour to $11, the raise to $11 in April, and 1,000 jobs gone in May in the fast food business. There is no connection.
No, there is a connection. If you want to make that connection, you can make the connection.
Restaurants in the rest of Washington state added jobs, and they did nationally.
Yeah, 2,800 restaurant jobs added in the rest of Washington state, but not in Seattle, where they lost jobs.
I'll give you this. Maybe employers aren't hiring people, and maybe it's because they're afraid. But after 5 months of looking at the numbers, you can't say that there's a direct correlation between the loss of jobs and the minimum wage increase. You can, because you're always right.
Wait, let's drop that subject, shall we?
We have discussed the free market system we enjoy in the USA, but we also acknowledged the role different levels of government take to fund services while also incentivizing certain activities. Politicians are elected to guide governments and act on behalf of the citizenry. We are going to look closely at some of the market interventions to control prices and costs using political mandates while also seeking evidence to tell us who are really the beneficiaries and who are penalized. Start with a couple terms you need to firmly commit to your memory. A price ceiling is a legally determined maximum price that sellers may charge. A price floor is a legally determined minimum price that sellers may receive. This firmly addresses price ceilings for rent controls. Governments use price ceilings to legislate the maximum rent landlords can charge tenants. These are put in place to make housing affordable for low-income people in expensive cities like New York, San Francisco, and Chicago. But what about the building owners who invested their own money in the apartment buildings? Can they still maintain the buildings if rent payments do not cover their costs? Recently, internet companies created rental markets for short-term use of apartments. Suppliers in these markets earn money by renting their house, apartment, or room for a few days. Airbnb, located in San Francisco, is one of these companies. Airbnb ran into problems in cities that have rent control regulations, which cause a shortage of apartments. People who live in rent-controlled apartments have an incentive to list their apartments on Airbnb at rents far above the controlled rent they pay. In San Francisco, landlords complain that some high-income renters moved out of the city but kept their rent-controlled apartments to re-rent them using Airbnb and other apartment-sharing sites. Consumer surplus is the difference between the highest price a consumer is willing to pay for a good or service and the actual price the consumer pays. The demand curve can be used to measure the total consumer surplus in a market. Consumers are willing to purchase a product up to the point where the marginal benefit of consuming a product is equal to its price. Teresa might be willing to pay $6 a cup for chai tea, but Tom would walk away unless the cost was only $5. Same with Terry, only entering the market when price drops to $4, and Tim when it drops to $3. Of course, if the price is $4 a cup, Terry, Tom, and Teresa would all enter the market and purchase a cup of chai tea. Tim would be out of the market because the price was too high. In this super simplistic example, we created a demand curve for chai tea at this one bistro. Make a mental note about this being a downward sloping to the right demand curve. Unless something wonky is happening, demand curves will be seen with this important downward sloping to the right characteristic. Marginal benefit is the additional benefit to a consumer from consuming one more unit of a good or service. The total amount of consumer surplus in a market is equal to the area below the demand curve and above the market price. This area represents the benefit to consumers in excess of the price they paid for the product. Panel A shows the consumer surplus for Teresa, Tom, and Terry when the price of tea is $3.50 per cup. Teresa would pay that much but enjoy it for the equivalent of $6. Her benefit eclipsed the $3.50 cost by about $2.50. This is $2.50 of Teresa's surplus because she drank that cup. Teresa's consumer surplus is equal to the area of the rectangle A. She feels good about that. Tom's consumer surplus is equal to the area of rectangle B, and Terry's consumer surplus is equal to the area of rectangle C. Consumer surplus in this market is equal to the sum of the areas of the rectangles A, B, and C, or the total area below the demand curve and above market price. In panel B, consumer surplus increases by the dark blue area as the market price drops from $3.50 to $3. Everyone who was in the market received additional consumer surplus benefits. They are each 50 cents more benefited, but we added Tim to the party. Tim buys a cup of chai tea, but his entry to the market is right at the margin of his willingness to buy that cup. He is ambivalent to having it or not. His consumer surplus is 0. His decision to buy that cup may come on because he wanted to spend time with his friend, who did want that cup of chai tea. I have ratcheted down the market to be only one cafe selling one product to 4 customers. Broadening the marketplace to thousands of cafes and tens of thousands of consumers, watch as the incremental increases of consumers entering the marketplace creates a smooth line, embracing all consumers of chai tea. When the $2 price is seen in the marketplace, Everything above the price and below the demand curve illustrates consumer surplus. The demand curve shows that most buyers of chai tea would be willing and able to pay more than the market price of $2. For each buyer, consumer surplus is equal to the difference between the highest price he or she is willing to pay and the market price actually paid. Therefore, the total amount of consumer surplus in the market for chai tea is equal to the area below the demand curve and above the market price. Consumer surplus represents the benefit to consumers in excess of the price they paid to purchase the product. Broadband internet connections across America and around the world really happened all within the last 30 years. It started with computers sharing data on floppy disks, then through cable connections peer-to-peer, using phone lines then into cable-connected networks. Pricing for these services became a challenge for both providers and consumers. Unfortunately, there was no database to access showing what the demand curve looked like. It needed to be created. The internet was developed as computers, tablets, mobile phones, digital media, and software-as-a-service applications came to life. Broadband internet connections, as a marketable service, made their entry in America, and predictably the first into the web were caught by high costs. Early adopters found the expensive connection fees bearable because their consumer surplus was at or higher than the costs being charged. In 2006, Greenstein and McDevitt developed a model to predict at what price points consumers would enter the market and how much would be bought. It was an articulation of consumer surplus at that point in time. Some providers of the service only created connections to the internet. Others provided a backbone of storage space and cloud computing infrastructure. In these cases, providing access to broadband internet connections created new services, integrating smartphones with tablets, laptops, and software-as-a-service solutions. Consumer surplus became a web combining several desirable outcomes. So far, I have talked about consumers as the center of surplus measurements. In order to really get a handle on all the surplus considerations in an economy, we need to target our attention also to the producers. Consumer surplus measures the net benefit to consumers from participating in a market, rather than the total benefit. Similarly, producer surplus measures the net benefit received by producers from participating in a market. They sell their wares to willing buyers. Producers are in the market because they seek the opportunity to sell their goods and services at prices at and above their costs of production. When that happens, producer surplus is realized. We now start to develop some more economics jargon to talk of competitive markets where there are many buyers and many sellers. An advantage of a competitive market system is that it results in efficient economic outcomes. Equilibrium in a competitive market results in the economically efficient level of output, where marginal benefits equals marginal costs. We stay in this market for chai tea, and this time we look at it as a producer. This time, consider producers each enter the market with different cost levels of production. This clumpy combination of producers shows each entering the market with different cost levels. Panel A shows Heavenly Tea's producer surplus. The lowest price Heavenly Tea is willing to accept to supply a cup of tea is equal to its marginal cost of producing that cup. When the market price of tea is $2, Heavenly receives producer surplus of 75 cents on the first cup, the area of rectangle A, 50 cents on the second cup, rectangle B, and 25 cents on the third cup, rectangle C. In panel B, the total amount of producer surplus sellers receive from selling chai tea can be calculated by adding up, for the entire market, the producer surplus received on each cup sold. In the figure, total producer surplus is equal to the shaded area above the supply curve and below the market price. With chai tea equilibrium price realized at $2 a cup, notice how those producers that can sell chai tea for $2 a cup and less each enjoy a level of surplus. Those that can sell and make a profit by selling at $1 a cup enjoy much more surplus than those who break even at $2. Of course, we see no surplus enjoyed by producers who need $3 a cup because they are not in the market at this price point. The term surplus captures the benefits experienced by people and businesses participating in the markets. You might have the experience of finding something you previously thought you would pay loads more to buy, but the price was lower than your purchase point break-even level. So you bought it and felt great about the deal you got it for. Your great experience is your consumer surplus. The producers of these great things on the market often find their competitive advantage is rooted in their ability to produce goods and services by being the low-cost producer. When others need $100 for a good to make ends meet, but you have figured out how to enter the same marketplace and make bank when selling for $85, you will be super happy to be the price taker and sell at the market price of $100. Now, your producer surplus is felt with sales turning a windfall profit of $15 a unit. Is that price gouging? No, it is not dishonest. It is experiencing good business skills that turns a profit that can be reinvested in the company to make it grow, employ more people at better wages, and also increase tax payments to keep the economy strong. That is part of doing business the American way. A competitive market is a market with many buyers and sellers. An advantage of this market system is that it results in efficient economic outcomes. Equilibrium in a competitive market results in the economically efficient level of output, where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Consumer surplus measures the benefit to consumers from buying a particular product, and producer surplus measures the benefit to firms from selling a particular product. Equilibrium in a competitive market results in the greatest amount of economic surplus, or total net benefit to society, from the production of a good or service. Economic efficiency is a market outcome in which the marginal benefit to consumers of the last unit consumed is equal to its marginal cost of production, and in which the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus is at a maximum. In this competitive market, equilibrium occurs at a quantity of 15,000 cups and a price of $2 per cup, where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. This level of output is economically efficient because every cup has been produced for which the marginal benefit to buyers is greater than or equal to the marginal cost to producers. Consumers demand goods while producers supply them. Participants enter market transactions only when they experience a surplus, or at least break even when buying or selling the product. This break-level point is the point of equilibrium. it is where marginal benefits of the consumers are equal to the marginal cost of producers. Higher sales prices will send consumers to find other sellers at lower prices. Lower than equilibrium prices will attract new producers to the market to increase product quantities. Equilibrium will be restored. Economic surplus is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. In a competitive market with many buyers and sellers and no government restrictions, economic surplus is at a maximum when the market is in equilibrium. It does not mean the two measures of surplus are equal, but the overall combination is as high as possible. The economic surplus in a market is the sum of the blue area representing consumer surplus and the red area representing producer surplus. Think of economic surplus as the area above the supply and below the demand curve. These are split at the equilibrium price, with some to consumer surplus and the rest to producer surplus. When there are no interventions to the free market, this competitive market equilibrium creates maximum efficiency and overall surplus. When the price of a good is set above its equilibrium price, economic surplus is less than it would be at the equilibrium price. It might happen because of regulations on production, tax on purchases, price ceilings or price floors set by legislature. The effect is a price artificially higher than equilibrium. When it happens to our chai tea example, instead of $2 a cup, price becomes $2.20 per cup. Now, consumers participating in the market decreases from 15,000 to 14,000. Those 1,000 buyers now out of the market have no consumer surplus to enjoy. They are out of the market, and their surplus left with them. In the same light, sellers of those 1,000 cups of chai tea are now out of the market as well. Their departure from the marketplace is not because their costs of production were too high. Their departure is because there are too many sellers at this price for everyone to stay fully engaged. It might be a sector-wide reduction in force, where some percent of each business's employees are laid off, or complete shutdown of some firms. These markets are out of whack, or accurately put, out of equilibrium. Economic surplus is maintained when a market is in competitive equilibrium. When a market is not in equilibrium, there is a deadweight loss. For example, when the price of chai tea is $2.20 per cup instead of $2, consumer surplus declines from an amount equal to the sum of areas A, B, and C to just area A. Producer surplus increases from the sum of areas D and E to the sum of areas B and D. At a price of $2.20, there is a deadweight loss equal to the sum of triangles C and E. Keep your eyes on this category, because we will see how some folks find ways to recapture some or all of this deadweight loss. Stay tuned. Not every individual is better off if a market is at its competitive equilibrium. Any producer would rather charge a higher price, and any consumer would rather pay a lower price than the equilibrium price. Producers or consumers who are dissatisfied with the competitive equilibrium price can lobby the government to legally require that a different price be charged. Support for governments setting price ceilings typically comes from consumers. New York is one of the cities that imposes rent control, which puts a ceiling on the maximum rent that landlords can charge for an apartment. A price ceiling, such as rent control, reduces economic efficiency. Let's take a look at this situation.
Hello, Manhattan Apartments.
I have called every realtor in the entire city.
But everything else that I saw was horrible.
It doesn't even have a sink.
Finding a place to live is always tense, but in many places, politicians have done something that makes it tougher. Normally, when you rent an apartment or house, it costs what it costs because of simple supply and demand. When demand is high, investors see a chance to make a profit. They build more housing. Then supply increases, runs ahead of demand, and prices come back down. The result is affordable housing. That's how it usually works. But in some 200 American cities, politicians, to protect poor people, passed laws that control rents, limit increases. But it so often happens, laws that try to protect us from cruelties of the market have unintended side effects. Look at what's happened here in the city where I live. This is some of New York's most valuable real estate. Does this look like an area that needs to be protected from market cruelties? If you could find a Fifth Avenue apartment on a floor this high with this spectacular view, the rent would be more than $10,000 a month. Alistair Cook has this view. Remember him from Masterpiece Theater?
Good evening. I'm Alistair Cook.
Cook lives at a large apartment on the top floor of this building. But he doesn't pay the $10,000 a month you'd have to pay. He pays less than a fifth that. Wouldn't you like to pay less than a fifth of your rent or your mortgage? Cook pays less because he scored. He was lucky enough to live in this fashionable building at a time when politicians, to help poor people, regulated the rents.
I think he's a thief.
Economist Walter Williams.
A thief? Yes, he's using government to take what belongs to one person and give it to him. That is, if there were no rent control, he would have to pay the market price. But he's not paying the market price.
But he's not breaking any laws.
But laws don't establish morality.
Now, Cook didn't ask for any special breaks. The system just gives it. Remember the Mayflower Madam? Sidney Biddle Barrows made lots of money running a brothel. She pays about half what you'd have to pay for her apartment. Lots of politicians, rich businessmen, and celebrities benefit from rent controls meant for the poor. We usually only find out about them after they've been exposed. Supermodel Kim Alexis lived under rent protection. So did singer Carly Simon and fashion designer Arnold Scazzi. When he put his apartment in Architectural Digest, he didn't mention he was getting a rent break meant for the needy. We've been trying for weeks to get inside a wealthy person's rent-controlled apartment with our cameras, but it's virtually impossible. People just laughed and said, no way. But we can show you Mia Farrow's old rent-controlled apartment because Woody Allen shot the movie Hannah and Her Sisters here, a third of what you and I would have to pay on the open market. It's bad enough that controls let rich insiders get special deals, but the bigger unintended consequence of the laws is that houses and apartments left on the free market cost more. Newcomers pay inflated rents because cities with rent control tend to have less housing. Where there's rent control, landlords don't want to build. In unregulated cities like Dallas and Chicago, lots of apartments are available. But in rent-controlled cities like New York, you may have to bribe someone to get an apartment.
You can pay brokers under the table sometimes, which helps.
But we would never do that.
I would never do that.
Finally, the most destructive unintended consequence of rent controls is that some landlords say, if I can't raise the rent, I won't make repairs. And they don't.
Short of aerial bombardment, the best way to destroy a city is through rent controls.
Rent control is a big reason many landlords abandon their buildings, just walk away from their investment. You see acres of it here in New York. All this has led some opinion makers to have doubts and led some politicians to question the wisdom of what they had done. 2 years ago, Massachusetts decided to end rent control.
People are building housing now in Boston for the first time in 20 years.
Author William Tucker, who wrote this book about housing policy, says it turned out that only 6% of the people getting rent protection in Massachusetts were poor. Those people are now getting subsidies.
It would be a very easy thing to subsidize all the people in any city that need a little help in paying their rent. But instead you impose this blanket system that ruins the housing market, benefits all kinds of people who don't need it, and then you say, oh, we've got a housing crisis.
And that's what we have in New York City and other places where rents are still protected. While the privileged, the insiders, those who know how to work the system, get to freeload. And that's how it usually works.
Price ceilings, like rent controls, establish the maximum price sellers are allowed to charge. They are only effective if the price ceiling is set below market equilibrium price. Just think about it. If equilibrium price for rent in Lewiston, Idaho is $750 a month, a price ceiling of $50,000 a month imposed in the marketplace would be pretty meaningless. It would be to mandate that no landlord could charge more than $50,000 a month. Okay, not a problem, right? Price ceilings only upset the market when the mandated maximum, or ceiling price, is set below equilibrium. Next, we can look at the opposite effect, called a price floor. During the Great Depression, many farmers were unable to sell their products, or could sell them only at very low prices. Farmers convinced the federal government to intervene to set price floors for agricultural products. Government intervention in agriculture has continued ever since. A price floor reduces economic efficiency. The federal government's farm programs often have resulted in large surpluses of wheat and other agricultural products. The government has usually bought surplus food or pay farmers to restrict supply by taking some land out of cultivation, the Conservation Reserve Program. In 2013, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the farm bill then under consideration would result in spending of more than $960 billion over 10 years. When equilibrium is at $3 a bushel of wheat, and if wheat farmers convince the government to impose a price floor of $3.50 per bushel, the amount of wheat sold will fall from 2 billion bushels per year to 1.8 billion. If we assume that farmers produce 1.8 billion bushels, producer surplus then increases by rectangle A, which is transferred from consumer surplus and falls by triangles B and C. Consumer surplus declines by rectangle A plus triangle B. There is a deadweight loss equal to triangles B and C, representing the decline in economic efficiency due to the price floor. In reality, a price floor of $3.50 per bushel will cause farmers to expand their production from 2 billion to 2.2 billion bushels, resulting in a surplus of wheat. Why 2.2 billion bushels, you ask? Look at the supply curve to see that at $3.50 per bushel, producers are willing and eager to supply 2.2 billion bushels. It will lead to a surplus of wheat in the market. Continue this understanding to apply it to price floors in the labor market. We watched a news broadcast video at the beginning of this lecture about the elevation of the minimum wages in Seattle, Washington. Minimum wage was elevated through a mandate of the law, and 1,000 workers were fired the next month. Employers were mandated to pay people more money per hour, but not how many employees to hire. This is seen on the graph where the equilibrium was established at W1, and the new minimum wage was imposed as a price floor above equilibrium. Free market consumers of laborers, the companies who employ them, are willing and able to employ people at L2 levels, fewer than when they were at equilibrium, or L1. At the same time, we have more employees willing to supply the workforce and their labor at this higher wage level. The surplus is the difference between L3 and L2. Needless to say, employers who demand workers are willing to engage fewer people at the higher wage level. Without rent control, the equilibrium rent is $1,500 per month. At that price, 2 million apartments would be rented. If the government imposes a rent ceiling of $1,000 per month, the quantity of apartments supplied decreases to 1.9 million, and the quantity of apartments demanded increases to 2,100,000, resulting in a shortage of 200,000 apartments. Producer surplus equal to the area of rectangle A is transferred from the landlord to renters, and there is a deadweight loss equal to the areas of triangles B and C. Because rent control leads to a shortage of apartments, renters who would otherwise not be able to find apartments have an incentive to offer landlords rents above the legal maximum. Where governments try to control prices by setting price ceilings or price floors, buyers and sellers often find a way around the controls. The result is a black market, a market in which buying and selling takes place at prices that violate government price regulations. Peer-to-peer rental sites provide landlords and tenants a way to avoid rent controls. Landlords use these sites to convert a yearly rental into a series of short-term rentals for which they can charge rents that exceed the legal maximum rent. Tenants can use peer-to-peer sites to rent their apartments to others at rents higher than the legal maximum they pay. Of course, they are all running against the laws put in place. When the government imposes price floors or price ceilings, some people win, some people lose, and there is a loss of economic efficiency. The winners with rent control are those who pay less for rent. Landlords may gain if they break the law by charging rents above the legal maximum and above what the equilibrium rents would be. The losers from rent control are the landlords, who abide by the law, and renters who are unable to find apartments at the controlled price. Rent control reduces economic efficiency because fewer apartments are rented than would be rented in a competitive market. Economists are generally skeptical of government attempts to interfere with competitive market equilibrium. Our analysis of rent control and of the federal farm programs is positive analysis. I used facts and figures to discuss what is traditionally debated using normative arguments. Whether these programs are desirable or undesirable is a normative question. Remember, you really cannot win an argument about what is right or wrong using any measurement. You need facts and figures to debate these because then you are talking about facts, not feelings. When the government taxes a good or service, it affects the market equilibrium for that good or service. One result of a tax is a decline in economic efficiency. When a government taxes a good or service, less of that good or service will be sold. Demand and supply curves are used to describe the deadweight loss that results from a tax. The true burden of a tax is the amount consumers and producers pay the government, and the deadweight loss from the tax. The deadweight loss from a tax is referred to as the excess burden of the tax. A tax is considered efficient if it imposes a small excess burden relative to the tax revenue that it raises. Remember I told you earlier to always make sure you are stating demand and supply curve shifts, moving to the right and to the left. Well, now I show you the exception to the right-left rule. Here we make curves move up and move down. It happens because of taxes. They are imperfect interruptions to markets taken out of equilibrium. Now we watch and learn what happens when a third party gets involved, our government. Without the tax, market equilibrium occurs at point A. The equilibrium price of cigarettes is $5 per pack, and 4 billion packs of cigarettes are sold per year. A $1 per pack tax on cigarettes will cause the supply curve for cigarettes to shift up by $1, from S1 to S2. The new equilibrium occurs at point B. The price of cigarettes will increase by 90 cents to $5.90 per pack, and the quantity sold will fall to 3.7 billion packs. The tax on cigarettes has increased the price paid by consumers from $5 to $5.90 per pack. Producers receive a price of $5.90 per pack, point B, but after paying the $1 tax, they are left with $4.90, point C. The government will receive tax revenue equal to the green shaded box. Some consumer surplus and some producer surplus will become tax revenue for the government, and some will become deadweight loss, shown by the yellow shaded area. With no tax on gasoline, the price would be $3.50 per gallon, and 144 billion gallons of gasoline would be sold each year. A 10 cents per gallon excise tax shifts up the supply curve from S1 to S2, raises the price consumers pay from $3.50 to $3.58, and lowers the price sellers receive from $3.50 to $3.48. Therefore, consumers pay 8 cents of the 10 cents per gallon tax on gasoline, and sellers pay 2 cents. Most of us think that as consumers, we are the ones paying all the tax burden. On this graph, it was modeled to show a shift of supply, and still the consumer paid 8 cents of the 10 cents collected. We need to revise this situation again in a minute. Tax incidence is the actual division of the burden of the tax between buyers and sellers in a market. The incidence of a tax does not depend on whether a tax is collected from the buyers of a good or from the sellers. Seriously? If I'm buying something using my money, then I am the one paying the tax, right? We need to look deeper at this one. Now, we approach it from the demand side. We need to see who pays the gas tax now. With no tax on gasoline, the demand curve is D1. If 10 cents per gallon tax is imposed that consumers are responsible for paying at the pump, the demand curve shifts down by the amount of the tax, from D1 to D2. In the new equilibrium, consumers pay a price of $3.58 per gallon, including the tax. Producers receive $3.48 per gallon. The result is the same as when producers were responsible for paying the tax. Well, a tax is a tax, and everyone in the market ultimately pays for it. I introduce you to a term you will spend a lot of time getting to know in this class: elasticity. You are looking at someone holding a rubber band and stretching it. I like this symbolism because it shows the normal way someone stretches one, horizontally. In economics, A perfectly horizontal demand curve is perfectly elastic. We are going to explore what perfect is in this class, but before we get there, I show you the opposite of elastic. That is, inelastic. In fall 2016, one of my students had a knee operation and used crutches to get around. What a perfect prop for an economics class! Someone on crutches needs a perfectly inelastic support. It needs to stand vertically and be stiff as a crutch. Now you have it. Remember, the elastic stretching rubber band has perfectly elastic and horizontal, and the inelastic crutch standing vertically. We will keep using this one. Rotate back to tax incidence to consider who pays more of a tax. It hinges on elasticity issues. If we know a bit about the slopes of the demand and supply curves, we can predict who will pay a larger share of the tax. Remember the cigarette tax graphs? The smokers have a relatively inelastic demand curve. Smokers want their smokes. Suppliers do not have such a steep supply curve. If they need to change crops, they can. The steep demand curve means the buyers have an inelastic demand, and as a result, they pay most of the tax burden. Sellers are still pegged to carry part of the sin tax, but smokers take the biggest load. If the demand curve is elastic, that is, more horizontal, they have the ability to change products when one gets a special tax applied to it. Think about a tax levied on Red Delicious apples. If you really do not want to pay more for that Red Delicious in the form of a tax, you can shift to Honeycrisp, or switch to oranges, or pears. As a result, buyers mostly do not have to pay much of the tax burden when their demand curves are relatively horizontal, or elastic. Who is left holding the bag? Of course, it is the sellers who pay most of the tax when consumer demand is elastic. Let's shift to something with less voluntary payment structure: Social Security taxes. Signed into law by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1935, the Social Security tax was structured to split the tax burden equally between employee and employer. At least, that is what lawmakers hoped would be the interpretation. We need to figure it out for ourselves. Who really pays most of the tax burden? Turns out, once employees agree to a benefits package with salary, healthcare, vacation, sick leave, and related reimbursements, they do not really work more or less based on their Social Security tax. For the most part, people work their 40-hour work week. Sometimes people work more when they are trying to justify a raise or a bonus. But really, most everyone is trying to justify a raise or bonus all the time, so they work extra time trying to make it happen. Really, it is not about the payment of their Social Security tax. We look closely at the elasticities of the demand curve of employers and the inelastic supply curve of employees. See how indicating a shift of the demand curve down by $1 imposed as the Social Security tax reduces the quantity of labor slightly, but the resolution of wage paid drops to show employers paid 5 cents of the tax, while employees paid 95 cents. Flip this to make it an upward shift of the supply curve by employees, and discover the same results seen a few seconds ago. Shifting demand down or supply up reveals the same results. Employees pay most of the tax incidence of Social Security taxes. We now take a look into the mechanics of economics to apply some basic math skills to the supply and demand curves. Take a look at the Q demand curve and the Q supply curve. Remember the downward sloping to the right demand curve? You recognize it with the negative sign in the QD formula and the positive sign on the upward sloping to the right QS supply curve. I want to find where equilibrium in this market will be found. I know it happens where supply equals demand. So, all we need to do is set equation QD equal to QS. A little numeric rearrangement and we have a solution for price, or P. At equilibrium, price is $2,500. In this case, the equilibrium rent for apartments is $2,500 per month, and the equilibrium quantity of apartments rented is 2,250,000. I need a couple additional points on this graph to expand it. The demand equation tells us that at a rent of $4,750, the quantity of apartments demanded will be 0. The supply equation tells us that at a rent of $769, the quantity of apartments supplied will be 0. The areas representing consumer surplus and producer surplus are also indicated on the graph. Connecting the points, two lines are articulated, supply and demand. Knowing that equilibrium was identified at $2,500, we create the horizontal line at this price. Above this price and below the demand curve, we find consumer surplus. And using the area of a triangle, we can calculate consumer surplus to be $2,531.25 million. Below this price and above the supply curve, we have producer surplus and can calculate it to be $947.375 million. That is, when the market is in equilibrium. Once we have estimated equations for the demand and supply of rental housing, a diagram can guide our numerical estimates of the economic effects of rent control. Consumer surplus falls by an amount equal to the area of triangle B and increases by an amount equal to the area of rectangle A. Producer surplus falls by an amount equal to the sum of the areas rectangle A and triangle C. The remaining producer surplus is equal to the area of triangle D. Deadweight loss is equal to the sum of areas of triangles B and C. Take a long look at this graph to see what the effect of the rent control really is in New York City. Can you see that the landlords remaining in the market are the ones who are the lowest cost providers, who are not investing in their buildings? If they were a small portion of the housing market and high-cost establishments were still in place, the city would look as fabulous as it did when it attracted people there 100 years ago. Today, visions of rundown, dilapidated, and deteriorating buildings fill minds to signal the poster of rent-controlled poverty. Do you think this is really what was intended when the rent control was launched? Really? With these formulas for supply and demand, and the impacts of rent control we just discussed, take a look at this summary table to see how consumer surplus went up marginally, producer surplus fell drastically, and deadweight loss represents so much lost value. Remember, this is the loss of the economic transactions that never happened because of the rent control law.